Hello and welcome to the first in a series of webinars from ID Comms. This is part of the 7 T's webinar series, and the first session today is looking at media transparency. We'll be doing 2 webinars on media transparency. This first one will look at the results from a recent global media transparency survey conducted by ID Comms in 2016 and followed up with another session, another webinar, which will be a workshop on how to achieve greater transparency in media when working with media agencies. We hope you enjoy the content. All the way through this, please suggest your questions and we will respond either in real time during the webinar or present via a Q&A at the end of the session. Thank you for watching and we hope you find this very useful. Hello and welcome to the ID Comms 2016 Media Transparency webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today will look at the results that we published from the Media Transparency Global Survey that ID Comms conducted in February and March this year. And we'll talk you through the results and look at some of the insights that come from it. The first thing to say in terms of format, I'll make a brief introduction of myself and also then of the subject. We'll have about 30 minutes worth of looking at the results of the survey and then we'll open up to Q&A. So during the course of this initial part of the presentation, please submit your questions through the fields on the page in front of you. The first thing I should say as well is that this first part of the recording, first part of the presentation, I should say, is pre-recorded. So what you're watching now is actually slightly pre-recorded. We are monitoring it live, just to facilitate us, to enable us to facilitate the Q&A. We'll then switch into live broadcast at the end of the presentation of the results, so that we can respond in real time to any questions that you have submitted. So I hope that works for you. The plan is for all future webinars to be produced live, but this one we've taken a decision to pre-record just to see how it goes. Anyway, so bear with us. Thank you for that. So just to introduce myself, my name is Tom Denford. I'm a co-founder and also Chief Strategy Officer of ID Comms. We are a global media consulting business working with some of the world's leading advertisers. And our purpose as a business is to help brands navigate the increasing complexities of media landscape. My background is mostly on agency side, although we founded the company in 2009 and have been fully independent since that point. I'm also host of a weekly YouTube series called MediaSnack. If you haven't seen that, you might find it useful because every single week we discuss 3 of the hottest topics on the global media scene. There'll be links provided where you can subscribe to this. You might find that helpful just to keep on top of some of these issues. Otherwise, you can just go to YouTube and search for ID Comms or MediaSnack and you'll find us easily there. Okay, so on to talking about transparency. Transparency is we believe, one of the key components to and drivers of a brand's media success. And in fact, transparency is the first in a series of 7 areas that we think are critical for brands to obsess about if they want to improve media performance. We build this into a framework which we use with our clients, which is called the 7 T's, which is a strategic framework for marketers and procurement to use. And the 7 T's that we refer to are the areas that we encourage brands to obsess about to improve their performance in media. Transparency is the first of these, and that's what we're discussing today. And in subsequent pieces of research and webinars, we will then look at the other 6 of the 7 T's, which is training, talent, technology, thinking, terms, and trading. All of those elements combined deliver competitive advantage to brands in media. Okay, so today is just about transparency. So let's look as to why it's important. It's talked about a lot in the industry, and we believe that the conversation around media transparency has become somewhat toxic because it's been obsessing about agency financial management, and words like ad fraud, ad blocking, viewability, all kind of get lumped under this issue of transparency, and what that's done in some ways has made the word transparency quite a toxic thing. And it's complex and confusing, and we wanted to try and simplify this by shining a bit of light on what perhaps transparency means and how important it is to marketers and to their agencies. So the hypothesis of our research lent on this idea of transparency being a key business principle. And through that, perhaps we can identify that transparency is something which both client or advertiser and their agency should aspire to, greater transparency, because that may be a component of trust. So our hypothesis of this piece of research is transparency breeds trust and is therefore the path to highly productive business relationships. Of course, all in the context of media planning and buying. It's an area which the industry has given a lot of focus. You can see here some of the headlines recently that have been part of that conversation, both in the UK, across Europe, and also in the US. And also, significant industry leadership is talking about trust. Just in the last week or so, Keith Weed, who's the CMO of Unilever, was quoted recently in the trade press, this week in fact, saying that trust is the magic ingredient. And Michael Roth, CEO of IPG, which is one of the large marketing services groups, last week said on a panel discussion that the issue of transparency is paramount to the issue of trust between us, the agencies, and their clients. So this is what people are talking about. We thought it would be helpful to ask some questions in this space and try to get a steer on how important transparency is to marketers, how big a component that is of trust, and also if there are any particular areas which were considered key drivers of trust. The methodology that we undertook to do this was to issue a web-based survey which consists of 5 questions, which I'll introduce to you in a second. We received 140 responses, which in a relatively kind of niche area like this, we were encouraged that was a robust enough sample to be able to publish a report. And the respondents comprised majority of client-side marketers, which is made up of marketing, media, and procurement specialists. And they had a range of global, regional, and local market responsibilities. And if we look at here the geographic spread, you can see that over 50%, nearly 2/3 was from Europe. About a quarter of respondents were from the US, and the remainder from the rest of the world. We also had respondents from the agencies represented, and actually looking at the respondents, they actually came from all of the 6 major agency holding companies, including as well some independent media agencies based in Europe and the US. The total value, based on our estimation, of the brands which participated in the survey in terms of their global media billings was around $20 billion. So, and we think that that's a significant indicator of sentiment within the media spending market. So from IDCOM's perspective, our ambition here was to try and elevate the conversation around transparency and use some insights gathered from the research to try and drive more meaningful conversations between advertisers and their agencies when it comes to aspiring for greater transparency. So before we just dig into the results, let me just remind you the questions that we asked. So we asked very simply 5 questions as part of this survey, and started from quite a macro perspective about transparency down to quite granular insight into what drives transparency and trust. So question 1, we asked, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Advertisers who have a close, trusted relationship with their external marketing agencies will tend to deliver a stronger marketing performance. Next, we asked, what levels of trust do you think currently exist between advertisers and specifically their media agencies? Thirdly, we asked, how do you see the trend over the coming year in the levels of trust between advertisers and their media agencies? And then, to what extent do you think that issues around transparency influence the levels of trust between advertisers and their media agencies? And then finally, we asked, which are the areas of transparency that you believe could most influence an advertiser's trust in their media agencies? Okay, so let's move on and have a look at the results from asking those questions. So first up, when we asked to what extent they agree, the respondents agree that a close, trusted relationship delivers stronger marketing performance, you can see here overwhelmingly, over 3/4 of respondents agree or strongly agree that trust is a really key component to delivering a stronger marketing performance, as you might expect. It was certainly a similar story when we looked at the results by region. 76% of European participants and 80% of US participants both agreed or strongly agreed that trusted relationship drove improved marketing performance. So when we look at the difference next on client respondents versus those agency respondents to that first question, interestingly, agencies overwhelmingly are very, very positive about the importance that trust plays in a stronger marketing performance. But you can see here on the left of this, 1/4 of all clients actually disagreed with the statement, which suggests to us that the relationship, that they don't believe necessarily that the relationship that they have with their agency and the quality of that relationship and the trust in that relationship necessarily influences marketing performance. Could that be that they don't see agencies as a significant influencer in marketing performance? Who knows? I doubt that's the case. But it's interesting to highlight that it's not as overwhelming when you split out client to agency as you might think. But yet agencies clearly believe that they have to have a trusted relationship in order to be able to deliver a good performance for the client. So let's move on to question 2. So what levels of trust do you think currently exist between advertisers and specifically their media agencies? So you can see on the left here the emphasis of the responses here, focusing from average to low to very low. And so having established that the majority of our respondents in the previous question believe that trust is critical or highly important to delivering a stronger marketing performance, the next step naturally was to then look at the current situation. So when asked about the current levels of trust that exist between advertisers and their media agencies, 86% on the left there of all respondents said they believed levels were average or low to very low. So it paints a slightly negative picture, clearly shows room for improvement in the level of trust perhaps between an advertiser and their media agencies. There are some slight variations when we look at it on a region by region basis. You can see on the right hand side there. The European respondents, in terms of European advertisers, were more sceptical and more likely to see that trust was very low. The implication of that could be that knowledge and understanding perhaps of media agency operating practice in Europe amongst clients, in our experience, tends to be higher and more sophisticated. And so maybe that there are clients in Europe who have achieved some more levels of transparency perhaps in their media agency operating practice. Or they may have just kind of, caught the cold of being cynical about media agency practice in Europe, and maybe US advertisers are yet to take such a firm or aggressive position. Europe and the US respondents seem to be in line, but you can see here on the right-hand side of that chart that US respondents, where respondents are saying that there's high or very high levels of trust, really that's being driven at the moment by the US. So there's a clear difference here in sentiment between European and US advertisers when it comes to trust in media agencies. So when we look at advertisers overall as a group versus agency respondents, we can see here that advertisers were more skeptical than agencies. So 31% on the left here of advertisers thought that levels of trust between advertisers and their agencies were low or very low, compared to 20% of agency respondents, although the pattern between the two is clearly very similar. Most people seem to have taken a more conservative point of view on that, to say that it's average, but we would suggest that that gives huge opportunity for improvement in the levels of transparency, or levels of trust, I should say, between advertiser and their agencies. Okay, let's move on to the responses to question 3. So the question 3 was, how do you see this trend over the coming year in the levels of trust? And the idea was to just see whether there was going to be a trend to improve or improving trust levels, or decreasing trust levels over time. And you can see here that there's a fairly clear balance of sentiment between those that think it will increase and those that think it will reduce. But I suppose most significant insight from this is that nearly a third of respondents overall believe there's going to be no change. And actually you can see the indication here is 80% of all respondents suggest no or little change in either direction. So, that is perhaps a lack of confidence in the ability of, the sides of this discussion to make any meaningful progress. And that's one of the key insights, I think, coming out of the research that we did in the survey, was that there is just an opportunity, there is goodwill on both sides to improve levels of transparency, which will drive trust and should increase business performance. But at the moment there seems to be skepticism on both sides, on the advertiser and the agency side, as to the likelihood of there being improvements or even change in the levels of trust over the coming year. When we look at that on a regional basis, it's interesting to see, again, a slight difference in sentiment. You can see here 44% of European marketers versus 34% of US marketers were optimistic about levels of trust increasing. And if you remember from the previous question, where we saw US advertisers being generally more positive about current state of transparency, you can see that these two questions together combined paint a really interesting picture. In the US, you've got advertisers who are positive about levels of trust, but actually see generally suggesting that it's going to decline. They're less optimistic, and they're quite pessimistic about the trend of trust, that it's going downwards. On the reverse of that, you've got European advertisers suggesting, are more likely to think that trust is very low or low with their media agencies, but are actually optimistic about levels of trust increasing over the coming year. So two very different dynamics. From our perspective, again, that suggests that there's a slight lag in sentiment. I think what we're seeing is US advertisers displaying behaviors that European advertisers displayed about a year or two ago. And so it could be a good indicator of how sentiment and relationship between advertiser and media agencies is going to evolve in the US in the coming year or two. So let's move on to question 4. Just to remind you, the question is, to what extent do you think that issues around transparency influence the levels of trust between advertisers and their media agencies? And you can see here quite clearly, 82% of all respondents believe that this is of high or very high influence, that transparency is clearly a key driver of trust between the advertiser and their media agencies. Both the advertisers and agencies agree to similar levels. And if we split that out and compare the advertiser versus the agency responses, you can see similar patterns, although you can see that advertisers are much more likely to say that it is of very high influence. There's clearly desire here, we believe, to improve levels of transparency as drivers of trust, because both the client side and the agency side respondents are sharing the same sentiments on the influence and the importance of transparency as a principle of a good productive relationship between the advertiser and the agency. So let's finally look at some of what we think could be the drivers of transparency, and what are the key areas of transparency that would really most determine levels of trust. Just to remind you, the question 5 was, which are the areas of transparency that you believe could most influence an advertiser's trust in their media agencies? Now, when we looked at the data from this, a clear trend emerges. The options, as you can see, ranged from a series of more financial or business-based quantifiable factors to some more subjective areas such as innovation and thought leadership. Overall, you can see on the ranking here, the factor that was selected most frequently was how the agency manages rebates and AVBs. So these are incentive payments paid to the agency as part of their trading with media vendors. And this is a complex area and an area where advertisers should have visibility on how there is passback of those rebates, media vendor rebates, to the advertiser. But clearly the indication here is that the way the agency manages rebates is not transparent enough, because it's a clear, important determining factor in the level of trust, which we know from the previous answers to previous questions is at a fairly low state. The second factor, determining factor and influence on the levels of trust, is how the agency makes money and how group buying deals, how group buying and shared deals work, and how the agency trades with media vendors. So all of those top 4 things, which are clear, there is a clear gap between those top 4 and then the remainder of the highly ranked answers. All of those concern the relationship that the agency potentially has with media vendors and how they make money beyond, or may make money beyond, the transparent way perhaps that the client is paying for services, either through commission or fee or some other hybrid model. And if we then look at how responses differed between European advertisers versus US advertisers, actually the order changes very slightly. The highest ranking answer amongst US advertisers is how the agency makes money. And that was by far the most, considered the most important factor in determining levels of trust. 81% of US advertisers said that how the agency makes money is the biggest influence on trust. How the agency manages rebates came lower down. That would be in line with our expectation, because the complexity, or the knowledge, I guess, the knowledge of US rebate market amongst US advertisers is less pronounced, and there's a more established rebate culture and market across Europe than in the US, and therefore perhaps that's driven that different ranking. But it's clear that the financial behaviours of agencies across the board is the biggest concern or the biggest influencer of the poor levels of trust at the moment which exist between advertisers and their media agencies, and the opportunity for agencies to address these concerns around the way they make money, their relationships with media vendors, and the way they manage the rebate market, the opportunity to drive transparency, a greater transparency in those. This clearly indicates that is the way to build or rebuild and repair trust in media agencies in the future. So we thought it would be interesting then to just look at, given the financial areas are the ones where, which seem to be considered the most important drivers of trust in media agencies, what do agencies think about that? So when we split out agency versus advertiser respondents, you can see a clear pattern. The most interesting thing, I think, is that agencies agree that the more financial elements of transparency are those which are highly influential on trust. The only place you can see in the middle of this data here is that agencies believe that how the agency manages client data and uses it for decision making, they think is a more important determinant of trust in the agency, to have some form of policy. I think it's interesting, frankly, actually, to look at the one above that as well, how the agency makes its planning recommendations. Advertisers think that that's a more important area. And you can see as you go down that the concerns on those slightly softer elements amongst agencies, those more subjective elements of transparency, are significantly less than their clients have ranked them. So, but broad alignment, I think we could say, from this data between advertiser and agency on the drivers of transparency in media. So now that we've gone through the data, what we'll do is I'll quickly summarize what we believe are the kind of key insights that come out of this. And stick with us, because I'm going to share with you details of an upcoming next stage webinar, which will be a workshop. So for those of you that are interested or inspired by some of these insights and want to know how to improve transparency with your media agency, or if you're an agency that wants to know how to rebuild trust in your clients by offering greater transparency, in 2 weeks' time we'll be doing a workshop in a webinar format to look at some more practical steps that can be taken by both sides to improve levels of transparency and trust in media. But to summarize our insights at this stage, it's clear that 3/4 of respondents overwhelmingly believe that a close and trusted relationship between advertisers and their external marketing agencies will deliver a stronger marketing performance. We can see that levels of trust currently between advertisers and their media agencies is really at a low point, but presents huge opportunity for improvement. 80%, over 80% of respondents anticipate no or little change in trust levels in the coming year. And that was something that we found particularly disappointing. There didn't seem to be the belief that this was going to change in any significant way. And hopefully we can kickstart that change today and in future initiatives around media transparency. 80% of respondents agreed that issues around transparency are highly influential in determining levels of trust between advertisers and their agencies, and getting greater clarity on rebates, agency business models, how agencies make money are really the most important factors in setting the levels of trust that advertisers can have in their media agencies. So we believe that we've delivered on the hypothesis. Transparency breeds trust and is therefore the path to highly productive business relationships. And the final thing is just to let you know of the next webinar that I mentioned. So this will be a practical workshop about how to deliver greater transparency and how to build trust between advertiser and media agencies. It will be on Wednesday, the 1st of June, in 2 weeks' time, at the same time. Okay, so that concludes the presentation part. Let's move to Q&A. Thank you for submitting your questions. We'll now click live to be able to respond to your questions for the next 20 minutes. Thanks very much.